So let's get into this and I'll help you figure out how to decipher what these different things mean on these websites, because it can be a little complicated if you don't know much about what they mean. Hi, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be talking about why it's important for you to know how to read a surf report yourself and not just rely on the generalized information given to you by sites like Surfline or Surf Captain, because sometimes they can be a little inaccurate, and it's a good idea for you to be able to keep a log or keep track of what conditions you notice are best for your skill level and be able to determine that yourself, because I have found personally that sometimes they are not quite accurate in their readings, and there's been days where they say that it won't be good for your typical surfer and I've had a lot of fun, and there's been days when they say that it's going to be really good and I don't end up having much fun at all. So let's get into the basics, the most fundamental important things that you should know right off the bat for reading the surf report and understanding what the waves are doing and what the conditions are like. The first one is wave height. These waves can vary depending on the conditions, or even just throughout the swell. They can vary in height, so it's really important to know what the waves are going to be like and make sure that you are comfortable with the waves that could possibly be coming in during a certain swell period, because they can really vary in height and you might find yourself out in the water in waves that you are not comfortable in. So the first one of the three is the most frequent waves. These are the waves that you'll be seeing most often coming in during a swell, and these waves tend to be quite smaller compared to the significant waves or the maximum height waves. So these waves can sometimes give you an idea of generally what the wave height is going to be like. And the next one is the significant waves. These waves come maybe around 1 in every 7 waves. These are definitely a little bigger than the most frequent waves, but it's good to know what size those will be, and they're usually a little bit bigger than the most frequent waves. The third one is the maximum waves of a swell, and these waves are only maybe about 3 in every 24 hours, but it's really important to note that the maximum waves can be twice the height of a significant wave. And so it's really important to know that if you're out in waves that seem ideal for your skill level, to know that there could be some very large set waves that come in, and you have to be comfortable being out in the surf in those kinds of waves, at the very least paddling through them or maybe getting hit by a couple of them. And that's why it's really important, especially as a beginner, that you don't go out in big surf, because you might find yourself stuck in some pretty big waves and find yourself pretty freaked out by some of those waves if you do happen to come across one of those maximum sized waves. For example, my husband was out surfing the other day. He's a pretty confident surfer, pretty comfortable in bigger waves. So the wave height was 5 to 7 feet. And he said that there was a pretty big set wave of 9 feet that came through during that time when he was out surfing. So it's really important to know that there can be some much bigger waves than the estimated height of the waves out in the surf when you're out there, and to be prepared to possibly have to go underneath or over one of those waves. The next important factor is the wind strength. This can really affect how the waves are breaking and how rideable they may or may not be. The best conditions would be low wind, if not no wind. If there is a little wind, then the most ideal condition would be to have offshore winds, because these can create a little cleaner waves. Onshore wind tends to create kind of choppier, messier waves, and it makes the waves a lot mushier. The third one is tidal movement, and tides really can affect a spot. Some spots are better on a high tide, some are better on a low tide, and some are better in between tides. Within a tidal period, it's around 24 hours. They change around every 6 hours, shifting maybe a half hour each day. There's 2 high tides and 2 low tides every day. One of them tends to be a lower low tide, and one tends to be a higher high tide, and the other 2 low and high tides tend to be a little less significant in their change. High tides tend to make the waves mushier and harder to catch depending on the spot you're at, and low tides tend to make it a little more shore breaky and to break a lot faster. It's important to note that at a low tide, beach breaks can tend to be a little more slammy and a little bit more fast and not as good, and reef breaks can tend to be a little better at a low tide because the topography of the ocean is a little more stable, and so it's a little better at a low tide. This is one of those factors that really can just depending on the spot, and it's good to note when you go out surfing at a spot whether or not it was high or low tide, and whether or not it was easy or hard for you to catch the waves. And this can really make it a lot easier to decide when you want to go out surfing and can make or break a surf session. So let's look a little bit at Surfline on my computer to get a little more context of exactly what I'll be talking about and what to look at and how to find it on Surfline. So we're on Surfline's website now, and if you need to, you can search up whatever break that you're looking for specifically. My break I already have kind of saved in my computer, so I can just go straight to it, which is the Oceanside Harbor. So it's kind of nice when you first scroll down, you can see different spots near your preferred break, and if that break that you usually go to is not very good, you can go to one of the other spots nearby. So that's really handy to have. So first, when we scroll down, we can see the conditions, the estimated conditions as to what they are right now. Surfline is saying it is 4 to 5 feet, chest to head high. We can see the swell, the primary swell, and the 2 secondary swells, and their direction, and how many seconds apart each wave is. We can also see the wind direction right now. It is saying it is 10 knots with 11 knot gusts, and it's onshore. We can also see what the tide is right now. It looks like it is a low tide at 11:58 a.m. They have this little snapshot that you can see the direction of the wind, what direction is blowing on or off the beach. You can also see what the water temperature is and what kind of wetsuit they're recommending that you wear based off the water temperature. If we continue to scroll down, we can see the forecast for the next 10 days. This is something new that Surfline has added for the free version, which is kind of nice because it used to just be 5 days with the free version, but now you can see further out. Of course, these are still just estimates of what they predict the waves will be like, and they're not totally guaranteed. They have 2 options for looking at the surf forecasting information. They have the graph or the table. Both of these can be helpful for different types of looking at information. The graph tends to be a little more simplified, but the table has a little bit more information that we will be using in the next video for determining what the wave conditions are actually going to be like out in the water. But for the sake of this video, we are just going to use the graph version so we can just simply look at some of the information that is helpful to know to figure out what the waves are like. So the first thing that we will come across is this graph of what the wave estimates are for the conditions now through the next 10 days. They come in 3-hour increments for you to be able to figure out roughly what the wave conditions will be like depending on what time of day that you're going to be going out. If we look at the wind graph, we can see pretty clearly that the wind is pretty mellow first thing in the morning, and then as the day goes on, like right now, it is pretty strong. It's 10 knots with 11 knot gusts, and it's really helpful to look at the gusts because that will also have an impact on the waves and whether or not they are a little more choppy or clean. And then as we get into the evening, it starts to mellow out again. So morning is usually the best time to go because it doesn't have the strong winds from the day that have been blowing across the ocean. Middle of the day is the least ideal because the wind tends to be the strongest, and then evening is the second most ideal time to go out. If we scroll down a little bit further, we will come across the tides graph. This is super helpful to try to figure out exactly how high or low the tide will be based off the time that you want to go out in the water. As we can see down here, we have the low tide, and then we have our higher low tide. We also have a lower high tide and a higher high tide. This is very typical throughout the day to have in a 24-hour period to have 2 low tides and 2 high tides. This can change a little bit depending on the moon cycles, but usually we have 4 of them and they change about half an hour each day. During the highest high tide, often spots can get a little bit more mushy, which can either be more ideal or less ideal, or sometimes if there's a big swell, sometimes this can actually make the waves a little bigger because there's so much water in the beach there that it can actually amplify the size of the waves, I've noticed. Also, with a low tide, the spot that I surf tends to not be the best at a low tide because it is a beach break and it tends to kind of just slam or close out whenever it's a really low tide. So I usually try to avoid going when that is the case. The spot I surf at tends to be best at a mid tide, I have noticed from my experience, and so that is usually the best time to go. Or when the waves are a little smaller and it's a high tide, it can be really fun waves for longboarding. Another really nice feature that Surfline has that's just handy to have close by if you're trying to sneak in a surf session either before or after work or before or after mothering duties if you're a mom, is that they have the last light and the first light and also the sunset and sunrise. This is really handy because the first light and the last light is actually more of the last or first time that you can get in the water. Sunrise and sunset is when the sun actually comes over the horizon versus having a little bit of light left on the horizon. So it's really nice to know the soonest you can get in the water or the last little bit of light that you will have to be able to get a little surf session snuck in when you can. If we scroll all the way back up to the top of the page, we will see a little tab called guide. This can be really helpful if you haven't surfed a beach very much or you're first just getting into surfing. This really gives you a good amount of just basic information on the spot, gives you an idea of the ideal surf conditions, the swell direction, the wind, the tide, and the height of the waves that tend to be best for the spot that you're trying to surf. They also give you a nice little description of the beach and where it is located and how to find it. They also tell you what kind of surfing abilities the spot is good for, what the vibe of the spot is, if it's welcoming or not, how crowded it can end up being. They also tell you how hard the paddle out is, which is what the shoulder burn means, the water quality, because this beach is close to a river, the quality doesn't end up being very good after a big rain. They also tell you about some hazards from the beach there, if there's rocks or any things you need to watch out for when you're paddling out or riding waves. They also tell you what kind of bottom it is. As I mentioned, with knowing whether or not it's a rock bottom or a sand bottom is really helpful when you're first learning how to surf. The best bottom I feel like is a sand bottom because it's soft and you don't have to worry about hitting yourself or your board. I hope this video was helpful to give you a little bit of basic information for reading waves and understanding some of the things that really impact the waves. If you'd like to check out a little bit more information, be sure to check out the next part 2 of this video that will get into more depth on all of the other factors that can really affect waves and how you can use those to get a better understanding of what the waves will actually be like. Thank you so much for watching this video and be sure to check out that part 2.